President, thank you so much, and I do appreciate the leadership on the Intelligence Committee and for leadership that has been there, and I would concur. You have a spot to be able to lead and a task to be able to be done, and you've studied this, so that must mean you know it, and we look forward to your leadership in the days ahead. So appreciate that very much. Mr. President, I do want to speak on a very different subject as well, and it's a subject that we're all going to face in the days ahead, and it's this wonderful issue about a government shutdown. We seem to forget at times in this body the issues that press around us, but the one that seems to get slipped under the rug most of the time is national debt, where we are and how we're going to try to address this in the days ahead. The conversation comes up, it seems to be on a regular basis now, about are we going to have a government shutdown, and that conversation about government shutdown ends up being in a very small portion of a very large debt that we face. And the challenge is, how do we actually address that based on its size? Well, let me just give a little bit of context to what I'm talking about. We're right now preparing within days to cross into the $33 trillion in total federal debt. $33 trillion. To give some context of that acceleration in federal debt and what is happening during this time period, from the time of Andrew Jackson, which was the last president that was president when we had no debt at all, from the time of Andrew Jackson till Ronald Reagan, our nation accumulated $1 trillion in total debt. From Andrew Jackson to Reagan, $1 trillion in total debt. From Reagan to the present, now we are $33 trillion in total debt. We're on a rapid acceleration of debt that has not slowed. To give you again the picture of where things have gone just in the last several years, if you go back 20 years ago to 2003, our total spending was just over $2 trillion. If you go back to 2013, 10 years ago, our total spending was less than $3.5 trillion. Our spending this year will be right at $6.5 trillion. So in the past 20 years, our spending has increased from just over $2 trillion to $6.5 trillion. To give you just the acceleration in spending just in the last few years, if I were to go back to 2018, before COVID, 2018 time period, our total spending was just over $4 trillion. This year's estimated spending is just under $6.5 trillion. That's $2.5 trillion of accelerated spending just from 2018 to now. To again set this in context, the revenue that's coming into the federal treasury this year is estimated at $4.8 trillion. $4.8 trillion. We're spending estimated $6.4 trillion. Now, I know that's a lot of numbers, but let me give you one just as a takeaway. We have almost $1.5 trillion of deficit that is overspending just this year. Some estimates, depending on what happens in the next few weeks, it could be almost $2 trillion in total overspending just this year. To put this in context, with the record revenue that's coming in this year at about $4.8 trillion, if we were spending the same this year as we did in 2018, a short 5 years ago, if we were spending the same this year as we were in 2018 prior to COVID, we would have a $700 billion surplus this year rather than an almost $2 trillion deficit this year. Because the record amount of revenue coming in this year compared to what our spending was 5 years ago, we would have been in surplus this year. But we're not, and it's at $1.5 trillion over that. We have a very serious issue. We should have very hard conversations about our revenue, about our spending, about the direction that we're actually heading, and about how do we get out of a $33 trillion debt. This is not going to take a year or 2 years. I've had folks that I've talked to recently even that have talked about the time in the early 90s and when we were at a balance of around $100 billion. And the work that was done by the Bush administration and the Clinton administration, 2 administrations in a row, to be able to work to get us back to a balance. 2 administrations in a row had to work on that. But here's the frightening thing. Our overspending this year is more than the total spending during the Clinton administration. Just our overspending this year. This is not going to be a simple process to be able to come out of. This is not even going to be 2 administrations in a row making agreements to be able to get back to balance. This is going to take decades. And my concern is that many here are not willing to start the first year of decades of work to be able to get us out. So, we have work to do on this. Myself and Senator Maggie Hassan, Democrat from New Hampshire, she and I sat down several years ago and started having a conversation about how do we end government shutdowns and actually get into a real dialogue about how do we actually deal with debt and deficit issues. From that productive conversation, she and I created a piece of legislation that's all designed just to prevent government shutdowns. All the conversation right now among the media seems to be about is a government shutdown coming at the end of this year, and we should not have one at the end of this month, the end of the fiscal year. We should continue to be able to keep going, but we should also have the debate of what direction are we going to go. So Senator Hassan and I came up with a very simple proposal. It's not a partisan proposal. It's a completely nonpartisan proposal. It is a simple proposal, quite frankly, that is equivalent to 2 things I had growing up. One was, if you don't finish your homework at school, you have to actually stay after class to be able to finish that. If you don't finish all your work that you had to get done then, stay after class, keep finishing it. When you're done, then you can leave out. The second one was, when my older brother and I would get into an argument, which of course as brothers, we never did get into an argument, but in that rare moment we got into an argument, my mom would put the 2 of us in a room and would say, you guys settle this, and when you're done, you can come out. We slammed those 2 ideas together into one simple proposal to how to end government shutdowns. If we get to the end of the fiscal year and the appropriations work is not done, like it is this year, we stay in session 7 days a week, and the only bills that can actually come up that are actually can be called up during that time period are appropriations bills. The second part of it is there is no travel for anyone, so we couldn't fly home and fly back, so no official nor campaign funds could be used to be able to travel. So we're in session 7 days a week. The only bills that are allowed to be brought up are appropriation bills. There is no travel, and the next part of it is simple. There's what's called a continuing resolution to maintain the government to be open so that the American people and federal workers are held harmless. It puts the pressure on this room, not on federal workers that are working for FAA, not on people that are working for the Housing Administration, not on our Border Patrol. Those individuals don't get a vote on this. They should not feel the pressure of a government shutdown. We can keep the system moving while we still have our arguments to be able to resolve those things. Why is this so important? A couple of reasons. One is we're the United States of America. We should actually have an organized system because the rest of the world watches us to try to figure out how to do government. And when we look dysfunctional, the rest of the world says, how are we going to figure this out if even the Americans can't figure this out? Now, we as Americans lose track of that at times, but the rest of the world is watching us. We should have our arguments. We are a representative republic. Every single voice counts, and we don't all agree. Great, bring it. That demonstrates us at our best. But let's actually resolve those issues rather than having government shutdowns in chaos ensuing, because we need to set a better example for the world. Second issue, much closer to home. We need to stop having government shutdowns because the American people are calling into federal agencies and expecting someone to answer the phone, expecting to get help on whether it be passports or permits or whatever process that it may be that they have to interact with the federal government. They need to be able to get somebody to answer the phone and to be able to resolve that. So this puts the American people struggling to be able to just get basic answers. Third is the federal workforce. We have millions of people that work in the federal family. They work all over the country. And when there's a government shutdown, there's two sets of things that actually occur. If you're a contractor, you're just out. Those contractors may be doing janitorial services in one of our buildings, or they may be supplying food services to someone. They're just out. They don't get repaid. They just lose money, period. Those that are actually on the federal payroll, they don't get their check during that time period. And they have this crazy, weird, essential, non-essential, some people laid off, some people not, but everyone's in chaos in that process. For those folks that are in the federal family, even though they may be declared essential or non-essential, you know what? Their car payment still comes in, their mortgage still comes in, they still got to put food on the table, but they're not getting a check during the time of a government shutdown. And so those individuals that live paycheck to paycheck, like many Americans do, suddenly have a gap, not by a fault of their own, but because this body couldn't resolve what we were going to do on the budgeting issues. And the fourth issue I've already partially mentioned, and that's the contractors. Let me just give you an example of what this means. Our southern border right now has the worst border crisis that we've ever faced as a nation. To give you a perspective on it, in the last few days, we've had up to 9,000 people illegally crossing our border a day in the last few days. We had one border crossing area just in Tucson where they had 2,000 people that crossed in a day. Those folks are being cut loose and released into the country. But it is chaos along our border. Our Border Patrol and CBP and all those folks that are law enforcement are doing their best to be able to help watch for safety and security of Americans while literally thousands of people are being cut loose into the country. They depend on some folks that are contractors in that area to help sometimes with transportation, with processing, with food, with medical care, all those things. Those contractors are very important to be able to help our Border Patrol in the chaos of what's actually happening. When there's a government shutdown, those contractors aren't going to be there. And the chaotic border that we have now will be even more chaotic at that moment. That should not happen because we can't resolve our differences here. We need the national security on that.
Mr. President, would the senator yield for a question?
I would yield to Senator Cornyn.
I just want to ask the senator from Oklahoma, 9,000 a day. I had to get out my calculator to figure out what that means. Are you talking about 3 million, 3.285 million?
That's possible
a year?
this year. That's possible.
If the current rate?
If the current rate sustains. Yeah, yielding back my time for Senator Cornyn and for others as well. 2 weeks ago, our nation crossed a threshold that most people just missed. We had just over 6 million people that have illegally crossed our southern border in less than 3 years under the Biden administration. Just over 6 million people. That number is the same number, that 6 million number is the same as both terms of the Obama administration and the Trump administration combined. The Biden administration has allowed more people to illegally cross our border in less than 3 years than the previous 12 years along our border. Those Border Patrol need help right now. They don't need a government shutdown. They need help coming alongside them. So, what Senator Hassan and I have done is proposed a very simple proposal. Let's stop government shutdowns. Let's end those. Let's not have the drama and the countdown clocks on 24 cable news TV. Let's have the arguments that we need to have. Let's talk through the appropriations that need to be done. That's work that we're required to do. but let's hold the federal workers harmless in the process. Let's hold federal contractors harmless in the process. And so we can settle the issues, do real planning. This ending government shutdowns bill is very straightforward. We just want to prevent government shutdowns. We just want to be able to stop the chaos and actually show the American people this body can have the arguments, resolve our differences, and move forward. This is something we should be bringing to a vote. This is something that has wide bipartisan support. Let's resolve this piece while we've still got more to be done. With that, I yield the floor.